Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It's Sunday, April the 12th, 2026. It's early afternoon on the West Coast. The current headline is that Donald Trump has said that the U.S. will blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Who knows what the situation will be when you listen to this. The Financial Times had an interesting piece last week about shutting the Strait of Hormuz being a template for China in Taiwan. Of course, that piece was written before Donald Trump decided to shut the strait. The piece was written by a Taiwan China expert, Eyck Freymann, who is a fellow at the Hoover Institution. And Eyck also has a new book out this week. It's called Defending Taiwan, a strategy to prevent war with China, and he's joining us, a very timely book. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Eyck, congratulations on the new book. How should we interpret this decision by Donald Trump to blockade the Strait of Hormuz in terms of what you've been writing and thinking about a similar kind of crisis in the Strait of Taiwan?
Well, first of all, Andrew, thank you for having me on the show. This is indeed a timely topic, and I'm happy to be discussing it with you. Look, I think this is yet another example of the Trump administration twisting and turning. They lack an integrated strategy for how their political, economic, and military goals line up. And as a result, I see them digging themselves deeper and deeper into a Middle Eastern quagmire. The fact is, Iran doesn't have a navy. It doesn't have an air force. It supposedly doesn't have a ballistic missile arsenal anymore. And yet it has shown itself capable of taking 20% of global oil supply offline indefinitely. Now, if the United States thinks it has a problem with Iran, it should gear up for China, because China has a far more sophisticated set of capabilities to squeeze global commerce in and around Taiwan. If the United States doesn't respond to this alarm bell and start to get ready to confront authoritarian adversaries that recognize they can squeeze on economic choke points, then our problems extend far beyond the Strait of Hormuz. They have to do with the defense of our treaty allies globally and ultimately our homeland. Look, I think the United States should not have gotten into this Middle Eastern war in the first place. We can talk about why. But now that we're in it, before we double down, I think this is a time to stand back and ask what we are trying to achieve politically, and then how our economic actions might line up to achieve those goals.
Last year, you had another timely book out called The Arsenal of Democracy. I think you were one of the authors of it, co-authored book, The Arsenal of Democracy, Technology, Industry, and Deterrence in an Age of Hard Choices. You seem to be suggesting maybe that the choices in Iran haven't been perhaps hard enough, at least from the American point of view.
Well, the first hard choice is the choice of setting priorities between theaters. As we know, the American people are not down with infinite adventures abroad. The American people are not even very supportive of any foreign policy actions that will raise the price of living at home. I think the Trump administration went to war with Iran thinking that it would be quick and easy, thinking that because we had overwhelming military superiority, that would translate to a political victory. And things just haven't turned out that way. And the reason is Iran recognized that they could escalate in the economic domain and that the United States didn't have a plan for what would come next. So the question that I would ask for this administration is, what are we trying to achieve in Iran. Clearly, it's not removing the Islamic Republic. We have tried that through assassinations, through bombing, and it hasn't worked so far. Clearly, there's limits to what the American people are willing to accept. And there's limits to what targets in Iran the president is willing to hit that go after Iranian civilians. And that's not because he's feeling like an ethical guy this morning. It's because he recognizes if he goes after Iran's electricity infrastructure, Iran will retaliate against water and electricity infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, and oil prices will go even higher. I think it's a step forward that the administration is clarifying that the nuclear issue comes first, and that all of these negotiations essentially hinge on whether Iran is willing to make credible commitments to give up its nuclear program. But I also think that the administration has more diffuse goals. They want to eliminate the Iranian regime's ability to control the Strait, clearly, and they also want to degrade its military industrial capability. And I don't think they've fully given up on the goal of regime change. Strategy is the art of connecting ends to means. And if you don't have a clear sense of what your ends are, you're going to continue to flail. Then we can talk about the lessons that China is learning from this. There are a considerable set of lessons. I think they're very concerning. But the first question that the administration has to ask is, how do we recognize that we're in a hole and then stop digging before it becomes too deep to get out?
So, as I said, you're a fellow at the Hoover Institution, where you focus on East Asia rather than the Middle East. Your new book is called Defending Taiwan. How are the Chinese? What's the view of all this, Eyck, from Beijing? Are they enjoying it? Are they getting their popcorn out and having a lot of fun watching the Americans flail around?
Yeah, I think Beijing is sophisticated enough to draw multiple lessons at the same time. On a purely, let's start with the positives for the United States. On a purely military technical level, aspects of this war have gone exceptionally well. Clearly, the US and Israeli intelligence was exceptionally good in some ways at the beginning of the war. These assassinations that took out so many of the leading Iranian figures using extraordinary cyber exploits, that's very impressive. The special forces raid that rescued the downed pilot, I mean, that was an amazing achievement. Other countries' special forces can't do that. The air-to-air refueling and the logistics chain that allows the US Air Force to send in bombers from the continental United States and then continuously pound targets in Iran day after day, 500 targets at a time. That is very impressive. Other countries' air forces can't do that, not even close. But and China, I'm sure, has also learned all kinds of lessons about the electronic signatures of our planes. They've learned about stuff that we're doing with electronic warfare and cyber, stuff that doesn't get reported. There's a whole universe of military lessons. We are very good at many of these operations, especially in the Middle East. We've been preparing for them for a long time. China has got to be impressed. But on a strategic level, I think China's lesson is broadly encouraging, because even though the US military is formidable, the US handling of the diplomatic and economic elements is completely incompetent. And, as Karl von Clausewitz tells us, war is, the continuation of politics by other means. War is a tool that you use to achieve your political objectives. But what is your political objective? If the objective is unachievable, then it doesn't matter how amazing your military capabilities. Also, China has learned that the US went into this war with absolutely no plan for the economic shock that came after, without preparing its population for the effects of it. So the war has no legitimacy among the US public. And then in a way that was going to put excess pain on US allies like Japan, South Korea, the Europeans that are oil importers that are suffering much more than the United States, which is energy independent. So I think China, from that point of view, is sitting back and saying, well, we don't have to pick a military fight with the United States. Why would we? We should just lead them by the nose into a situation where they have to choose between letting Taiwan go without a fight or confronting us in a way that has no domestic legitimacy in the United States, that drives wedges between the US and its allies, and that creates an economic crisis that eventually the American people say, we won't take this, we want to make a deal. So I think it just confirms China's intuition, which is what I discussed in the book, which is that you can get Taiwan without fighting. This is just a gap in the US strategy that you can exploit. And the argument that I'm making now is this is what the book has been warning about. We keep getting wake-up calls and snoozing the alarm. Now is the time to actually get out of bed and confront this problem before it is too late.
Are the Chinese, in terms of their approach to geopolitics, is it always Taiwan defining how they behave? There's been lots of stories about Chinese support or intelligence support, economic, maybe even military support for the Iranians. But are they doing all this from the point of view of Taiwan? Is Taiwan number 1, 2, and 3 on their priority list when it comes to foreign politics?
China's overarching goal is what Xi Jinping calls national rejuvenation. And that is a whole of society project that has a deadline of 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And national rejuvenation has a foreign policy element, but it goes far beyond foreign policy. As I like to say, China wants to win every gold medal in the Olympics, and every silver medal, and every bronze. They want to be at the lead in every human endeavor, from space exploration to the deep sea and the polar regions, to leadership in international organizations.
Well, that makes them no different from, certainly no different from the United States, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, the United States has achieved, at the height of its power, call it in the early 90s or the early 2000s, a sort of hyperpower where the US was just dominant across, every possible dimension that you could use to measure a country. And there haven't been many examples in world history where a single country has been that paramount. Maybe Tang China in the 9th and 10th centuries for a little bit, but there haven't been very many examples in history where one country is just so dominant above the rest. And certainly not in the modern era since the world has globalized. That's what China wants. And they are systematically pursuing that goal in a way that tries to strike a balance between all these objectives. So if you're Xi Jinping, we can get into it a bit from your question. I think you're already referring to it. Yeah, Taiwan has this incredibly significant emotional value for China because it's the unfinished business of China's civil war, right? The regime or the government in Taipei proves every day, just by existing, that Chinese people can live in freedom with democracy and human rights and freedom of conscience in a capitalist system that is more technologically advanced and vastly more prosperous than mainland China, that is respected by the world, admired by the world. Like, you go to Taiwan. Taiwan is an extraordinary place, and its very existence is a thorn in the hand of the PRC. So yes, the PRC wants to get rid of Taiwan as an autonomous entity. And also, it's not just about wanting Taiwan, it's about the way they want Taiwan. Because Taiwan represents, ever since the founding of the People's Republic of China, a national a part of national, quote unquote, reunification or rejuvenation that the United States is denying to them. So part of taking Taiwan is showing that they can do it over the objections of the Americans, and in a way that will essentially change the game board of the power balance in the Western Pacific. It's partly about Taiwan's chips, right? If China seizes control of Taiwan's chips, they suddenly take over the commanding heights of AI, basically overnight. It's partly about the geography of the region. If China can use Taiwan as a forward base for their navy, essentially there goes Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. China's going to dominate the rest of this region with its naval power and eventually cross the Pacific and be able to hold our hemisphere at risk. And partly it's about the economics of the region and countries, not just Taiwan, but Japan, South Korea, and others that the United States depends on for essential technologies and manufacturing, partners that we would need if we ever wanted to reindustrialize ourselves. Yeah, if China can take over Taiwan, they can make these countries submit to them in the economic issues. So we will never reindustrialize. I mean, we will be hollowed out and turned into Argentina. So if Taiwan falls by force or coercion, that sets in motion a chain of events that makes all the rest of national rejuvenation much, much easier to achieve.
Hold on. So you're saying that if China took over Taiwan, America would become like Argentina? Is that what you just said?
Not right away, but
in the long term, in
the long term, that's
years.
China's goal, right? China wants to be, economically speaking, they want to be at the forefront of every technology, every major industry. They don't want to import anything, and they want the rest of the world to spread it wide and take whatever China wants to sell them.
Does that make you, you're in DC at the moment, I know you spend a lot of time with government officials of one kind or another, you're at Hoover. Does that make you a China hawk? How do you position yourself within the Sino-analyst community?
I don't like the line between hawks and doves. I think that's it's more based on vibes than on substance. I think the United States has never faced a more formidable adversary, because the adversaries that we faced in the past, the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the 20th century, and then to an extent Great Britain and France in the 19th, they had these ideas of subordinating us, but they didn't have the means. We were, protected by oceans. We were basically economically unplugged from the world. The Soviet Union, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, they never came close to rivaling us as a industrial, technological power. Not really. I mean, they were impressive in their own ways, but not really. And as a result, if it had come to that, we could have retreated to our own country within our own hemisphere, and things would have been, not great, but they would not have been as catastrophic as they would be today. Where China is now, positioning itself to move into the forefront in all of the key emerging technologies. It already is the world's manufacturing juggernaut. And the world has become economically globalized in a way that just can't be undone without impoverishing our nation. So, yeah, I think China's aspiration is they don't want to fight us, but they want to hollow us out. They want to accelerate the process of hollowing us out economically. And that requires a response that is resolved and sophisticated, that involves working with other countries to impair their strategy. Now, I don't think that we're destined for war, not by any means. And this book doesn't make that argument. I don't think they want a war. I don't think we want one either. But we need a different approach, because they are just exceptionally sophisticated, and we cannot deter them by ourselves. And the key battleground here is the economies of the Western Pacific region. This is the economic center of gravity in the world. These are the countries that are involved in the supply chains that make basically everything, from chips to ships to the materials to make rockets and airplanes. It's all, every supply chain goes through this region. You cannot let China change the rules of the game in this region to weaponize those economies against us. You can't allow it.
You're presenting this in economic terms, the need to defend Taiwan from a Western point of view and from an American economic point of view. What about the moral dimension, Eyck? Donald Trump doesn't seem to believe in morality when it comes to defending other countries. He certainly doesn't believe it in Ukraine and elsewhere. Do you think, I mean, I take your point on the Chinese long-term strategy, which I think vividly contrasts with American short-termism, but do Americans have a moral responsibility to defend Taiwan? Yeah, Donald Trump might say something like, well, why should I care about Taiwan? It's like Ukraine or somewhere else. It's a long way away and it doesn't really pertain to my own interests.
I'm someone who's spent time in Taiwan. I have Taiwanese friends. I care about Taiwan. I think Taiwan's democracy is worth protecting. I think it is a shining example of how, a Chinese society can become a free society. And I think that, I should hope for the day when the mainland will become a democracy just like Taiwan. And I don't want to see any democracy anywhere extinguished by force or coercion by an authoritarian superpower. I think that makes the whole world less safe. But the United States had an interest in preventing Taiwan from being brought to heel before it became a democracy in the 1990s. And I think even if Taiwan were not a democracy, we would have a responsibility. But the fact that Taiwan is a democracy under threat only intensifies it. In other words, it's not a vital national interest. You could call it an important or even an extremely important national interest. The vital national interest is that you can't allow China to take control of this region by force or coercion. You just can't allow it. And arguably, we also have an interest that China can't be allowed to take, a dominant lead in AI, because that is the prosperity and the individual freedom and the personal safety of the next generation. But of course, there is a principled reason too. If we want to talk about bipartisanship here, if one party doesn't think that this matters in particular, you can make this argument purely on the basis of national interests.
Thinking of AI, I take your point, but isn't it conceivable that China could establish a dominant position with AI without invading Taiwan? Or you think that the only way that China can really truly dominate the AI economy or AI technology is by invading or controlling Taiwan?
Oh, it's not just about that. It's that we need Taiwan for our AI.
Say more.
We depend on Taiwan more than China does. We have cut off Taiwan's ability to export the most advanced chips to China. But Taiwan produces 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors. It produces 99% of the cutting-edge NVIDIA GPUs that are used to train the advanced frontier models. So these are, complex supply chains. These chips are generally designed in the United States, and then there's Dutch machines and some South Korean components and some Japanese components, and there's stuff from around the world. But the final fabrication of the chips takes place in Taiwan. And we have been trying over the past 5 years, starting with the CHIPS Act under the Biden administration, to make these in America. And we are 2 generations behind Taiwan in making these chips. So we are producing at the 4 nanometer node, and then there's a 3 nanometer, which is better than that, and a 2 nanometer. They're making the 2 nanometers in Taiwan. And there's been many public reports that the Arizona facility it's not commercially competitive. So these chips are coming out much more expensive. The quality is not as high, and they have difficulty scaling up production for a whole bunch of reasons, including that we don't have the workforce. Our workers are not as skilled at doing this. I mean, Taiwan has a whole ecosystem, whole universities. It's central to the society, is this industry, and they are exceptionally good at it. And the frontier is moving forward with blazing speed. So Taiwan has been smart. They have worked with us, recognizing that, they need a relationship with us, but they are too smart to give us the crown jewels. So we are going to depend on Taiwan for the foreseeable future. They are 5 years ahead of us now. They will be 5 years ahead of us in 5 years. And China is making an all-out effort, doing literally everything they can. Cost is no objection to reproducing the entire supply chain within China. So all of those Dutch machines, the Japanese and the South Korean components, all of that, China is trying to figure out how to make all those pieces. And the hardest single part to do is the fabrication, the part that Taiwan does. So if you imagine a world where Taiwan's fabs, the fabs are the semiconductor plants, are taken offline, basically there's an instantaneous global financial crisis, because NVIDIA, Meta, Google, Microsoft, these 7 companies that are 70% or 40% of the S&P 500. I mean, their valuations just all are the AI trade, right? So if you set back the AI timelines by 5 to 10 years or whatever it is, then these valuations make no sense. So we have an instantaneous financial crisis, and we also have a recession because the hyperscalers are spending $600 billion on data centers this year. This is the only thing that's keeping the US economy out of recession right now. And that's even setting aside the risk that the US and China go to economic war. All of that is like on top. It would make the crisis even worse. But if you imagine a world where the Taiwan fabs are taken offline, then it's a sprint of who can build up an alternative supply chain faster. And if China wins that race, well, then they do win in AI. But for now, we rely on Taiwan at least as much as China does. And that's a big, big problem.
That was an interesting piece last week in the New York Times about a new era of world war has arrived. Of course, one example is Ukraine, another Iran, Lebanon, perhaps another in Taiwan, although we hope not. Your book is about avoiding war. What I don't understand, maybe you're a military guy, you can explain this, is in the worst case scenario, if there was a war over Taiwan between the United States and China, what would it look like? I mean, these are nuclear powers. Would it look like Korea or Vietnam or Iran or the Lebanon? What form would it take?
So I thank you for asking that question. People don't ask it enough. A war between the US and China would look fundamentally different from any war that we've fought or prepared for in the last 80 years. And the reason is all those wars you named were wars on land. And a US-China war would be a war at sea. China, let's assume that we're fighting over Taiwan. Thanks for calling up the map. China would mass its forces in what's called the Eastern Theater Command, which is on the left side of that map.
Yeah, and for people just listening, we're looking at a map of China, Taiwan, and the Taiwan Strait, which of course exists between it.
And they would, maybe you can call back the map for a moment. They would have to do several things simultaneously. They need to take control of the skies with fighter jets. They need to repel Taiwan's air forces and make it dangerous for US and Japanese aircraft to operate. So protect the skies. And then they would need to take control of the undersea so that we couldn't send our submarines in to go kill their ships. And then they would need to take control of the water on the surface, ideally on all sides of the Taiwan Strait. And then they would send tens of thousands of men across the Taiwan Strait, which is about 80 miles at its narrowest point. They would travel in amphibious vessels, essentially ships could roll up close to the beach, and then the men would sort of storm the beaches in the way you imagine Normandy. They might also try to deposit some men from the air by parachute or helicopter, although that's much more dangerous. They probably couldn't do a significant number that way. And Taiwan would try to sink those ships coming in. They would try to hold together their command and control and their communications so they could continue to fight and one unit could talk to another. But Taiwan would basically try to repel the invasion itself. And they might use drones, mines, cyber, other various tools to make it harder for the invaders. Meanwhile, the US, possibly with help from allies, hopefully with help from allies, would come in and try to take care of China's Navy and Air Force to put as many of them out of commission as possible, take back control over the surface and the airspace to make it easier for the Taiwan forces to keep fighting. And if we learn anything from history, and the Pacific War with Japan is probably the best example, some of these engagements would be decisive in the first few minutes to hours, because we have very, very, very long-range precision munitions now. They can reach, in some cases, 1,000 miles and hit targets plus or minus a few meters. And yet we've used a lot of them in Iran, but we still have a fair number. And if you know where the targets are that you're shooting at, and the adversary can't see you, you can sink a lot of the adversary's key platforms right away, and then their whole force sort of falls apart. So it would be very fast, very intense, focused on missiles first, followed by drones. And the reason China hasn't attempted this is that the defender has a geographic advantage. It's just really, really hard to synchronize everything to get across the strait. But we have to think about this scenario because China has built an exceptionally large and diversified force, and in some respects, they have home field advantage. And so we need to be on the ball here. Also, as you know, the character of warfare is changing, as you see in Ukraine, as you see in Iran. Drones matter more. If you can be spotted, you have to move very fast or you can be killed very quickly. So we have a very formidable American allied force. We could probably win if we fought today, but we also have to make investments so that we're prepared for the fight of tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't quite know what winning would be. If we were having this conversation in the late 1930s, I probably wouldn't be doing it on the internet. And we were talking about Japan and maybe Japanese control of the Pacific. You might make, not you, but somebody like you might make the same argument. Well, the Japanese could do this and that, and they could bomb Pearl Harbor and so on and so forth. And most people would think, well, they'd have to be insane because that would only ignite a world war and bring in the Americans, and eventually Japan would be defeated. I'm not sure if that's so inevitable about China, given their military and economic strength. But my question for you, given the apocalyptic scenario you just drew, is, are there military figures in Beijing who believe that this is conceivable? Is this the kind of thing that gets discussed politically or militarily in Beijing?
This is a scenario that they're systematically building for. Xi Jinping is doing everything that he would be doing if he wanted to put the country on a war footing to fight the United States, and nothing that he would be doing if he didn't think that. So they're for real. And they are building the capability to try to take and hold Taiwan by force because they believe that if they have it, they might get Taiwan for free. Because we might say, you know what, screw this, we're not fighting this. Now, you raised the prospect of nuclear escalation. Now, that can't be ruled out. I've participated in war games myself where things have gone nuclear. But war games are just simulations. I think in the real world, both sides would have very, very powerful incentives not to use nuclear weapons first, because if you war game this multiple times, you just see there's so many of these scenarios where the nuclear use spins out of control. The presence of nuclear weapons on both sides shapes the conversation. So, for example, if you're the United States, it's a difficult question. Even in a shooting war with China, do you shoot at targets inside mainland China? Or do you only shoot at ships and aircraft outside of mainland China? That's a key line that it would be up to the president to decide on. So the fact of the existence of nuclear weapons is it's like fundamental to the calculus. But I think the hope would be on both sides that you can have enough of a persuasive nuclear deterrent that you can find the conflict to the conventional level. And then I think the theory of deterrence in the United States is, if you can operationally defeat their attempt to put enough boots on the ground to hold Taiwan, then it's very hard to see how they can win. I mean, they can protract it. They can say, well, we're going to rebuild our fleet and maybe we'll put mines all around Taiwan's harbors and we're going to do this the hard way. We're not backing down. Maybe, but then hypothetically, you can do economic warfare against them. You can mine their coasts. You can bomb targets in mainland China. And it's hard to see how they come out of that the winner. So there are some people, and the book argues you have to take very, very seriously these risks of protracted war, because maybe Xi Jinping thinks, fine, if I can't do it the easy way, I'll do it the hard way. But the fact that he's been deterred so far, he's been in power for 13 years, suggests that there is some combination of threats that can make him say, you know what, this prize isn't worth it. And that's how you're going to keep doing it, deterring him day by day, and by helping him understand that there is still a chance that he can get the prize for free. You don't want to entirely rule that out. You need to make him think that the best move for him is to wait and continue to grow his strength. But at the same time, you have to make sure that you're prepared for the deterrence of tomorrow.
If we were having this conversation 15 years ago about Russia, Putin, and Ukraine, we might be speaking also in sort of apocalyptic terms, but imagining, well, this could never happen. And of course, it has happened. What what does Beijing and Xi and the Chinese military learn from what Russia has done in Ukraine?
So that's a great question. And there's a lot of debate on this among military and strategic analysts. My own view is he's learned, I don't want to do this the military way. I'm too smart for that. I will win without fighting. I will create scenarios where Taiwan falls into my control because the Americans come to the brink of a crisis and they say, we don't want to accept this crisis. I think China's military hasn't fought a major war since 1979 when they fought the Vietnamese, and it didn't go particularly well. And they saw Putin discover with horror in late February of 2022 that when his forces were sent to seize Hostomel Airport outside Kyiv, they were repelled because they just were not competent and ready to fight. And the Ukrainians fought with conviction, but they also fought with effective tactics. And they bought themselves enough time to essentially put the population psychologically in a place that, we can win this, we can resist. And therefore, Ukraine as a society went from being like, this is a hopeless thing to this is a winnable thing. If I'm Beijing, I really, really, really don't want that because, setting aside the question of putting troops on the ground in Taiwan, facing like a prolonged counterinsurgency in Taiwan, unimaginably costly and messy. I would just want to do it in an easier way. Now, there's other military lessons that they've learned. For example, drones matter a lot and so forth. But I think the overarching strategic lesson is you go against Taiwan not with these military tools. You build the military tools just in case, but then your plan A is you force a crisis, for example, by declaring that anyone who comes and goes to Taiwan now has to clear customs through the mainland. This is a scenario I call the quarantine. And if the United States doesn't have an answer to that, then Beijing wins. Because if Beijing controls who and what comes and goes to Taiwan, Taiwan can't rebuild its military. Beijing can seize control of the chips if they want. The US can't sell more weapons or send more military advisors to Taiwan. It's checkmate. So if Beijing creates a situation like that, well, it's not war, but the United States has to accept it and up the ante, or it's been defeated. I think they're so much more likely to create a situation like that.
Very briefly, have the Taiwanese been encouraged by what's happened? I mean, they're obviously not thrilled that Russia's invaded Ukraine, I would assume, but have they been encouraged by the success of the Ukrainians in defending themselves against a supposed superpower?
Some have, but some say, I really don't want Taiwan to become Ukraine. And the smart ones say, Xi Jinping has learned that the best way to move against Taiwan is not with an invasion. It's with this thing called a quarantine. It's by seizing control of who and what comes and goes, saying, oh, that flight that just took off from SFO to Taipei, terribly sorry, Eyck is on that plane. We don't want Eyck going to Taipei. So would you terribly mind United Airlines making a pit stop in Shanghai so that Eyck can clear customs? Oh, terribly sorry. There's some problem with Eyck's paperwork. We need to impound the aircraft. If China can do that and get away with it, Taiwan is looking at the United States and how it is treating its other allies. And they're saying, what are the odds that the United States actually comes to our aid if it's that kind of a fuzzy scenario? What are the odds that the United States responds to that with actions that could create a global financial shock? And if the answer is not, well, then we really are in trouble. So that's the realization. The realization is not that Ukrainians can't fight. Everyone is impressed by Ukraine. But the fear is that China has figured out, or the bad guys in general have figured out a way to squeeze and blackmail the West, which is just to threaten them with prolonged economic pain and then get what they want. And the United States will have to learn to deal with this, or we will be extorted, not just for Taiwan, but for everything else that we have and care about.
This is all very depressing, right? But let's end on a positive note. Your book is your book is entitled Defending Taiwan. a strategy to prevent war with China. I don't think anyone really wants war with China, even the hardcore China hawks. How do we do that? How do we defend Taiwan so that America wins, Taiwan wins, and maybe China doesn't lose? Is that the way you're thinking about this?
Yeah, that's the goal. That's the goal. Is you have to figure out how to sustain some version of the current situation and just keep sustaining it day by day. And the way that you do that is first of all, I think it's entirely doable because it's been done for the last 50 years. The way that it works is you need to make the different tools of your national policy, your diplomacy, your military stuff, including your nukes and your economics, fit together. And then you have to pursue it in an organized way with allies. On the diplomatic side, you say to Beijing, you guys are free to work this out by yourselves with Taiwan. If the Taiwanese agree to accept some version of what you call reunification, and so be it. We don't take a stake and we don't take a position on Taiwan's status. Our position is it can't happen through force or coercion. It has to be acceptable democratically to the people of Taiwan. But apart from, that's a principled position because of what the effects that would have on the rest of the region if they fell by force or coercion. But you figure it out with Taiwan. We won't force the Taiwanese to negotiate, but we're not going to tell them not to negotiate. That's a principled policy. We should maintain that policy. You should threaten China that if they push Taiwan in the gray zone, doing the kinds of things that I'm describing, like seizing control with customs rules, that you'll respond in a proportionate way, not a disproportionate way, but you will respond. And then you have to tell Taiwan, it's up to you. Your fate is in your hands. We're going to help you. We'll support you, but it's up to you. Meanwhile, you have to work with allies and partners to say, what are we going to do to speak from the same page about this problem set? And if things go wrong, if things collapse with China, what's our plan? And then you maintain a military power, the conventional military forces that I was just describing, to show China that it can't win if it escalates to war. And then finally, you build an economic plan so that the bad guys can't extort us anymore. So they don't have us over a barrel anymore by threatening economic crises. And that requires working with allies to build more economic resilience so that if we have a big shock, it's not the end of the world and we can hold our ground. You do these things together, you can maintain an honorable peace for another generation. We just need the resolve to do it.
Another generation, defending Taiwan, a strategy to prevent war with China, although the way you present China, in the long term, China wants Taiwan, so it might be 1 or 2 generations, but in the end, there'll probably be a crisis, won't there, right? Very briefly. To end on a dark note.
You know, the fate of Taiwan is not up for the United States to decide. The status of Taiwan is a question for China and Taiwan to figure out. But the United States has a principled position that this should be done peacefully, without force or coercion. If they can work it out without force and coercion, then that should be okay. And that is the principled policy. And the United States has maintained that for 50 years. We should maintain that for as long as it takes. And I think if Beijing learns that carrots work better than sticks, if they can work to win the trust of those in Taiwan, if we continue to wait, who knows? Who knows what history holds? It might happen that China and Taiwan are unified under a democratic government. I think that would be the best possible outcome.
Well, that would be a very sunny end to this crisis. Defending Taiwan, a strategy to prevent war with China, by my guest, Eyck Freymann. Very interesting conversation, Eyck. Congratulations on the book. It's out this week. And we'll have to get you back on. I'd love to do a whole show on Hong Kong and what that all means in terms of Taiwan too. But thank you again.
Anytime.
I know you've got to run. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. Much appreciated.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.